The desert sun hammered down on the New Mexico wasteland like divine judgment, turning the air itself into a shimmering wall of heat. At the edge of a remote military training facility, one that existed on no official map, bore no designation, answered to no public oversight, a line of Navy SEAL snipers stood in disciplined silence. 8 men, warriors forged in the crucible of Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other hellholes the American public would never hear about. Men who had earned their tridents through blood, sweat, and an unyielding refusal to quit. And beside them stood a woman. She didn't wear a uniform. No name tape identified her. No rank insignia decorated her shoulders. She wore faded denim jeans, a battered leather jacket despite the murderous heat, and a worn gray cap that had seen better decades. Her rifle case was custom work, matte black carbon fiber, with no manufacturer's logo, no military markings, nothing to suggest where it came from or who carried it. Her eyes, hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses, scanned the range with a stillness that unnerved the men around her. She hadn't spoken more than 5 words since arriving that morning. Just a quiet, "Ma'am," to the range officer, a nod to the instructor, and then nothing but silence. They didn't know her name, not her real one anyway. The paperwork listed her as Contractor S. Calloway, Civilian Baseline Assessment. But among the SEALs, whispers had already started. Someone called her the Ghost. Another said, the Ringer. A third, with more cynicism than curiosity, simply muttered, diversity hire, under his breath. None of them knew the truth. The range instructor, a grizzled Navy Master Chief with 3 combat deployments and a chest full of ribbons, called out the parameters. 1,200 yards, elevated targets, wind variable, gusting to 15 knots. You'll have 6 rounds, make them count. The first SEAL stepped to the line. A solid shooter, combat-proven, confident. He settled into position, read the wind, made his adjustments. His first shot kicked up dust 2 feet left of the target. He corrected. Second shot, high. By his 6th round, he'd managed 3 hits out of 6. Respectable, not exceptional. The second SEAL did better, 4 hits. The third matched him. The 4th and 5th hit 5 out of 6, drawing approving nods from the instructors. Then it was her turn. Sierra Calloway stepped to the line with movements that seemed almost lazy in their efficiency. No wasted motion, no theatrics. She knelt, opened her case, and assembled her rifle with hands that moved like they'd performed this ritual 10,000 times. The weapon was a work of art, a precision rifle that looked like it had been built by someone who understood that accuracy wasn't just about tolerances and barrel harmonics, but about the connection between shooter and steel. On the barrel, barely visible, were small scratches, notches, too many to count in a glance. The world fell away as she settled into position. No deep breathing exercises, no lengthy preparation. Her focus narrowed to a single point where intention met physics, where will became trajectory. Target Bravo 7, the instructor called out, watching her through binoculars. Wind northeast, 5 to 6 knots, variable. She didn't respond, didn't acknowledge. Her breathing slowed to something barely perceptible. The range went quiet. Even the SEALs, men who made their living with rifles, found themselves holding their breath. The crack of her rifle split the air like a thunderclap. 1,200 yards downrange, the steel target rang with a sound like a church bell. Dead center. Perfect. Again, the instructor said, his voice carefully neutral. She chambered the next round with liquid efficiency. Fired. Another perfect hit. By the 5th shot, she was hitting targets at varying distances, odd angles, one partially obscured by brush and terrain. By the 6th, she'd completed the entire sequence in half the time of the fastest SEAL, with a perfect score that made the morning's previous efforts look like amateur hour. When she stood, saved her weapon, and began breaking down her rifle, nobody spoke for a long moment. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, until one of the SEALs, A tall, wiry operator named Reese Atwood let out a low whistle. "Who the hell is she?" he muttered to the man beside him. Nobody had an answer. But in the observation tower overlooking the range, an old man watched through weathered eyes that had seen more than their share of remarkable shooters. Colonel Werner Flint, 71 years old, retired Army Ranger, veteran of operations that still carried classification stamps, stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He'd seen that shooting style before, recognized the stance, the breathing pattern, the way she settled into the rifle like it was an extension of her own body. He'd seen it 30 years ago in the deserts of Kuwait from a young ranger named Garrett Calloway who'd saved his life during an ambush that should have killed them both. And now, watching this woman shoot, Werner Flint felt the ghost of old debts stirring in his chest like a resurrection. 18 years earlier, Montana. The year was 2006, and Sierra Calloway was 11 years old. The cabin sat in a valley so remote that maps didn't bother marking it. 3 hours from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a dirt track that washed out every spring and froze solid every winter. The kind of place people came to when they wanted the world to forget them, or when they needed to forget the world. Sierra sat on the porch steps, a .22 rifle across her knees, her small hands cleaning the barrel with a cloth her father had given her before he died. The cloth was old now, stained with gun oil and memories. She cleaned the rifle every night, even when she hadn't fired it, especially when she hadn't fired it. Her uncle Roland sat in a weathered chair behind her, whittling a piece of pine into something that might eventually become a duck decoy. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with hands scarred from decades of hard living and harder choices. Former Delta Force, though he never talked about it. The kind of man who could disappear into the wilderness for weeks and emerge looking more at ease than he ever did around other people. "You're going to wear that barrel smooth if you keep at it," he said without looking up from his carving. "Dad said maintenance is meditation," Sierra replied, her voice still carrying the high notes of childhood, but with an undertone of something older. Something that came from watching your parents die when you were 7 years old. Roland's knife paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. "Your dad said a lot of things, most of them worth remembering. The accident had happened at Fort Benning. Training exercise gone wrong. Parachute malfunction, they'd said. Routine jump turned fatal. Garrett Calloway and his wife, Sierra's mother, both gone in an instant. The Army had expressed its condolences, paid out the death benefits, and moved on to the next crisis. That was how institutions worked. They ground people up and kept rolling. Roland had driven 12 hours to collect his niece from the base, taken one look at the hollow-eyed child clutching her father's rifle case and journal, and made a decision. She wasn't going into the system. She wasn't going to some foster home where they'd try to make her normal, make her forget, make her into something other than Garrett Calloway's daughter. So he'd brought her here, to the Montana wilderness, to a place where the only rules were the ones nature enforced, and taught her everything her father would have wanted her to know. "Target practice tomorrow," Roland said, standing and stretching. "Dawn. Deer are moving through the East Ridge." Sierra nodded, still working the cloth along the barrel. In the dying light, she looked small and alone, a child in a world that had proven itself cruel and arbitrary. But her hands moved with certainty on the rifle, and her eyes, when she looked up at the darkening mountains, held something that went beyond grief. They held purpose. The years passed in the mountains like water over stone, slowly reshaping everything while appearing to change nothing at all. Sierra grew from a grief-stricken child into something harder, leaner, more self-contained. She learned to track elk through snow so deep it would swallow a grown man. She learned to shoot from positions most military snipers would consider impossible. She learned patience, stillness, and the art of becoming invisible in plain sight. Her father's journal became her Bible. Garrett Calloway had been meticulous in his note-taking, documenting techniques he'd learned from other soldiers, innovations he'd developed himself, lessons paid for in sweat and occasionally blood. He'd served with men from different eras, different branches, different philosophies of warfare, and he'd written it all down, page after page of knowledge that most people would never see, never understand, never need. But Sierra needed it. She devoured every page, practiced every technique, pushed herself until the methods became muscle memory and the principles became instinct. By the time she was 16, she could outshoot her uncle. By 18, she was making shots that should have been impossible for someone without formal military training. By 21, she'd stopped thinking of the rifle as a tool and started thinking of it as a conversation. A dialogue between herself, the wind, the distance, and the target. She lived off-grid, making money as a wilderness guide in the summer months, trapping in the winter, and avoiding the world of people as much as possible. She had no use for society, for its rules and expectations, and the way it tried to sand down anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions of normal. But she had a hunger for something she couldn't quite name, a restlessness that drove her to test herself in ways her uncle's teaching and her father's journal couldn't satisfy. So she started entering competitions, not the sanctioned ones, not the official matches where paperwork and background checks and club memberships were required. The underground circuit, the cash-only, no questions asked, shooting competitions that moved around the Southwest like a traveling circus of violence and skill. Arizona, Nevada, Wyoming, wherever men gathered to prove themselves with rifles, and nobody cared about your name or your history. She never won. Not officially. She'd dominate the competition, post scores that left everyone else in the dust, and then walk away before the prize ceremony, before the photographs, before anyone could get more than a glimpse of her face. They started calling her Echo on the circuit, the woman who appeared, destroyed the competition, and vanished like she'd never been there. Ghost stories spread among shooters, tales of impossible shots, of a woman who read wind like prophecy and made corrections that defied conventional wisdom. And then, in the fall of 2023, someone captured her on video. It was an 8-second clip, grainy footage from a competition in Arizona. It showed a figure in a gray cap making a 1,400-yard shot in conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. The video went viral in military and shooting communities, shared through forums and group chats, analyzed frame by frame by people trying to reverse engineer her technique. The video reached the Pentagon, and the Pentagon, always hungry for advantages, always searching for the next innovation in warfare, took notice. 3 weeks later, a man in a rented SUV drove 12 hours to find a cabin that wasn't supposed to exist, to offer a woman with no military record a contract that would change everything. His name was Wilson, and he looked exactly like what he was, a mid-level Department of Defense contractor who spent his days shuffling paperwork and his nights wondering if he'd made the right career choices. 50-something, soft around the middle, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that might have been appropriate in an office, but looked ridiculous in the Montana wilderness. Sierra met him on the porch with a rifle in her hands and no expression on her face. "Miss Calloway?" he said, trying for friendly and landing somewhere near nervous. "Depends on what you want." Wilson held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Just to talk. I'm with the Department of Defense, contractor liaison. I'm not here to cause any trouble." "Then you should probably leave before you find some anyway." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've driven a long way. Could you spare 5 minutes?" Sierra studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the porch steps. 5 minutes. Talk. Wilson sat carefully, like he expected the wood to give way beneath him. He pulled a tablet from his bag, swiped through a few screens, then turned it to face her. "You made quite an impression," he said, showing her the viral video. 1,400 yards. Moving target, 20-knot crosswind. Shot like that, most military snipers would call it luck. It wasn't luck. "I know, that's why I'm here." He closed the tablet, The DoD is running an experimental program, Camp Sentinel, Virginia. We're testing SEAL sniper training protocols, trying to establish baseline effectiveness metrics. We need a control group, someone with no formal military training, no institutional bias, just raw skill. You want me to compete against SEALs? We want you to shoot beside them. Let us measure the results. 3 weeks, all expenses paid, $50,000 cash on completion. Sierra's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on the rifle. $50,000 was more money than she'd seen in years. It was freedom, or at least, it was options. And then what? She asked. Then you walk away. No strings, no obligations. You're a data point in a study, nothing more. Why me? Wilson's smile turned slightly more genuine. Because you're the best shooter nobody's ever heard of. And because we need someone who won't be impressed by tridents and combat records. Someone who'll just shoot. Sierra looked past him, toward the mountains that had been her home and her prison for most of her life. She thought about her father's journal, about all those techniques and lessons that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. She thought about the rifle in her hands and the hunger in her chest that never quite went away. 3 weeks, she said, then I'm gone. 3 weeks, Wilson agreed. He stood, brushed dust from his khakis, and headed back to his SUV. As he opened the door, he paused and looked back at her. Miss Calloway, that shot in the video, how'd you make it? Sierra's lips quirked in something that might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. I listened to what my father taught me, she said, and then I did it better. Camp Sentinel existed in that gray space between official military installations and the black sites that governments never acknowledged. It sat in the Virginia mountains, surrounded by forests so thick that satellite imagery showed nothing but green canopy. The facility trained America's most elite snipers, SEAL Team 6, Delta Force, Marine Scout snipers, men who could put a bullet through a target's eye socket from 1,000 yards away and then disappear into terrain like smoke. Sierra arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, driven in an unmarked van with blacked-out windows. When the doors opened, she stepped out into cold mountain air that reminded her of home and found herself facing 8 men in tactical gear who looked at her like she was an unwelcome curiosity. The briefing room was Spartan. Concrete walls, metal chairs, a projector screen at the front. The 8 SEAL candidates sat in a loose cluster, their body language radiating casual competence and barely concealed skepticism. They ranged in age from late 20s to late 30s, all carrying the lean, hard-muscled build of men who lived in constant physical readiness. Combat veterans, every one of them. Men who'd earned their place through blood and determination. And then there was Sierra, sitting alone in the back row, wearing the same faded jeans and leather jacket she'd worn for the drive, looking like she'd wandered into the wrong building entirely. The door opened and a man walked in. Tall, ramrod straight despite his 71 years, with white hair cropped military short and eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Colonel Werner Flint moved like someone who'd spent 50 years training his body to obey, without question. And his presence filled the room the way smoke fills a house fire, completely, unavoidably, with the promise of consequences. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and authority, and contractor, welcome to Camp Sentinel. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Flint had been teaching men to kill from distance since before most of them were born, and he had no patience for ceremony. You're here because you're supposed to be the best, he continued, pacing slowly at the front of the room. You've earned your tridents. You've proven yourselves in combat. The Department of Defense has invested millions in your training. He paused, let that sink in, then gestured toward Sierra without looking at her. She's here as a control group, civilian contractor, no formal military training, no SEAL experience, no combat deployments. She's the baseline we're measuring you against. The room shifted uncomfortably. Reese Atwood, sitting in the front row, made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. Seriously? Some contractor is supposed to show us how to shoot? Flint's eyes cut to him like a blade. She's here to prove that the taxpayers are getting their money's worth, that your training produces results beyond what raw talent can achieve. He paused. Unless you think a civilian can outperform you? Another SEAL, a stocky operator with a thick neck and serious eyes, muttered something to his neighbor. The words were quiet, but Sierra heard them anyway. Diversity hire bullshit. Flint's head snapped around. You have something to say, petty officer? No, Colonel. Good, because I don't care about diversity. I don't care about politics. I care about results. He looked at each of them in turn. You think you're the best? Prove it. Show me that your training and experience means something. Because if that woman in the back shoots better than you, then maybe we need to reconsider what we're teaching. The silence that followed was thick with wounded pride and simmering resentment. These were alpha warriors, men who'd built their identities on being the most dangerous people in any room. The suggestion that a civilian woman might outperform them wasn't just offensive, it was existentially threatening. Sierra sat in the back and said nothing. She'd heard it all before, in different words, in different places. Skepticism was just noise. Proof was what mattered. You have 3 weeks, Flint said. Various tests, various scenarios, long range, close range, moving targets, stress conditions. You'll be evaluated on accuracy, speed, adaptability, and tactical thinking. He looked at Sierra for the first time. Contractor Calloway will participate in the same exercises. At the end, we'll compare the data. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Respect here is earned, not given. You want it? Earn it. All of you. He left without waiting for questions, and the room slowly emptied as the SEALs filed out, most of them shooting glances at Sierra that ranged from dismissive to hostile. Atwood was the last to leave. He stopped near her row, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. Nothing personal, he said, but you're out of your depth here. Sierra met his eyes without blinking. Guess we'll see. Yeah, he said, we will. After he left, Sierra sat alone in the empty briefing room, listening to the silence. She'd expected the hostility. Hell, she'd have been surprised if they'd welcomed her with open arms. These men had earned their place through suffering and sacrifice. She was just some contractor who'd walked in off the street, but she'd earned her place too. In different ways, through different trials, but earned it nonetheless. 3 weeks, she thought. 3 weeks to show them what Garrett Calloway's daughter could do. She stood, shouldered her rifle case, and walked out into the cold Virginia morning to prove it. The first week at Camp Sentinel was designed to separate the competent from the exceptional, to identify weaknesses and expose limitations. For the SEAL candidates, it was a refinement of skills they'd spent years developing. For Sierra, it was something else entirely, a measurement against standards she'd never trained for, in an environment that felt both alien and strangely familiar. The days started at 0:30 and didn't end until muscles screamed and eyes burned. Physical conditioning, marksmanship fundamentals, terrain navigation, equipment maintenance. The instructors pushed hard, watching for cracks in composure or lapses in performance. The SEALs moved through it with the confidence of men who'd done harder things in worse places. Sierra just kept pace. She didn't dominate, didn't showboat. She ran the obstacle courses at the middle of the pack, completed the land navigation exercises without fanfare, cleaned her weapons with quiet efficiency. To the casual observer, she looked competent but unexceptional. Just another shooter trying not to embarrass herself. But Werner Flint watched her with different eyes. He saw the efficiency in her movements, the way she conserved energy while others burned it wastefully. He noticed how she observed before acting, how she seemed to map terrain with a glance and remember every detail. Most of all, he noticed her shooting stance, the way she settled into her rifle, the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle adjustments she made without conscious thought. He'd seen it before, 33 years ago in a different desert from a different shooter. On the fifth day, they ran the 1,000-yard qualification. A standard test, nothing fancy. Elevated targets at known distances, timed fire, scored for accuracy. The kind of shooting that separated competent marksmen from true snipers. The range sat in a natural bowl between two ridges, with targets placed at various distances from 600 to 1,200 yards. Wind was the challenge. It swirled unpredictably through the terrain, creating conditions that changed minute by minute. Reading it required experience, intuition, and a touch of something that couldn't be taught. The SEALs went first, one by one. They were good, damn good. Most hit 7 or 8 out of 10 targets. A few managed 9. Reese Atwood, who'd proven himself the best shot in the group, put 9 rounds on target with mechanical precision, missing only a partially obscured plate at 1,100 yards. 9 out of 10, the range officer called out. Best score of the day. Petty Officer Atwood, that's shooting. Atwood accepted the praise with a tight nod, clearly pleased but trying not to show it. He glanced towards Sierra as he left the line. The look said everything he didn't. Your turn, contractor. Let's see what you've got. Sierra approached the line. She assembled her rifle with the same practiced movements the SEALs had witnessed before. Efficient, certain, no wasted motion. Time seemed to slow as she settled into position. No elaborate preparation, no lengthy breathing exercises. Her awareness expanded outward, reading wind patterns in the subtle movement of grass, feeling temperature gradients on her skin, calculating atmospheric density from the way sound carried across the valley. The range officer ran through the target sequence, calling out distances in conditions. Sierra didn't acknowledge him. Her mind had entered a state of absolute clarity where physics and instinct merged into perfect understanding. Her first shot broke like thunder in the cold mountain air. 1,200 yards downrange, the steel target sang. Dead center. Perfect. Hit, the range officer confirmed, surprise creeping into his professional monotone. She fired again. Another hit. Then another. Targets at varying distances, different angles, some clear and some partially obscured. She moved through the sequence with a rhythm that seemed almost meditative, each shot measured and deliberate, no hesitation between rounds. By her 8th shot, the other SEALs had stopped pretending not to watch. They stood in a loose cluster, arms crossed, faces showing various degrees of disbelief and grudging respect. Even Atwood had gone quiet, his earlier confidence giving way to something that looked almost like concern. Sierra's 9th shot hit a target at 900 yards that was barely visible through a gap in the terrain. The steel rang clear and bright. One more to go. The final target was the hardest, 1,100 yards, partially obscured by brush, with wind swirling through the bowl in unpredictable patterns. She made an adjustment to her scope, tiny, almost imperceptible, then settled in, breathed, and fired. The bullet flew true, cutting through wind and distance like destiny. The target rang. 10 out of 10, perfect score. And she'd done it in half the time Atwood had taken. The silence on the range was profound. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was taking a moment to acknowledge what it had just witnessed. Sierra safed her weapon, stood, and began breaking down her rifle. She didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the stares, didn't say a word, just went through her post-firing routine with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Werner Flint, watching from the tower, felt recognition strike him like cold water. That wasn't just skill, that was legacy. After the range cleared, after the SEALs had filed off to debrief and process what they'd seen, Flint found Sierra cleaning her rifle in the armory. She sat alone at a bench, running a boar snake through the barrel with slow, meditative strokes. That was remarkable shooting, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Sierra didn't look up. It was adequate. Adequate? Flint almost smiled. That technique you used, the way you adjusted for wind in the bowl, that's not standard doctrine. No, she agreed. It's not. Where'd you learn it? Now she did look up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. They were gray, he noticed, the color of storm clouds over mountains. My father's journal. He learned it from someone a long time ago. A weight settled in Flint's stomach. Your father, he was military? Army Ranger, died at Fort Benning, training accident 2002. The armory suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Flint knew he should walk away, should maintain professional distance, should keep the past buried where it belonged. But sometimes the past didn't stay buried. Sometimes it came back wearing the face of a woman you'd never met, using techniques taught by a man you'd failed to save. What was his name? Flint heard himself ask. Sierra's hands paused on the rifle. Garrett Calloway. Did you know him? Did you know him? Such a simple question, such an impossibly complicated answer. Werner Flint had known Garrett Calloway, had served with him in the burning hell of Kuwait in 1991, had crouched beside him in a drainage ditch while Iraqi artillery turned the world into fire and shrapnel, had watched Garrett drag 2 wounded soldiers to safety while under sustained machine gun fire, then turn back to provide covering fire for Flint's own extraction, had promised Garrett, in the moments after, that if anything ever happened to him, Flint would look after his family, and then had failed to keep that promise when Garrett died in a stateside training accident a decade later, leaving a 7-year-old daughter alone in the world. Yes, Flint said quietly, I knew him. Sierra studied his face, reading something there that made her expression shift slightly. He wrote about you, in his journal. Not by name, but the details fit. Operation Desert Storm, Kuwait, IED ambush. He wrote that he learned some of his best techniques from an old ranger who'd served in Korea. I never served in Korea, Flint said. Wrong generation. But I studied with men who did. Learned from them. Operation Paul Bunyan, the DMZ tensions of '76. The valleys there created wind patterns similar to what we have here. The counterintuitive reading method, Sierra said, where you calculate the inverse of what standard doctrine suggests. Flint felt pride cut through the guilt. Your father was a good student. Looks like you are too. Sierra returned to cleaning her rifle. He wrote that you saved his life. He's got it backwards. He saved mine. Then I guess we're even. No, Flint said, his voice carrying weight that went beyond words. We're not even close to even. He left her there, sitting alone in the armory with her father's rifle and her father's techniques, and a legacy she didn't fully understand yet. But she would. Before the 3 weeks ended, she would. Because Werner Flint had failed Garrett Calloway once. He wouldn't fail his daughter. Not again. Not ever. The second week at Camp Sentinel brought a shift in atmosphere. The SEALs no longer looked at Sierra with open dismissal. The hostility hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more complex. Wariness mixed with grudging curiosity, skepticism tempered by what they'd witnessed on the range. She'd proven she could shoot. The question now was whether she could do everything else that being a sniper demanded. Werner Flint changed the training regimen. Days became harder, longer, more demanding. He pushed them through night navigation exercises in terrain so rough it shredded gear and tested resolve. He ran them through stress drills designed to break concentration and expose weakness. He created scenarios where perfect shooting meant nothing if you couldn't read terrain, anticipate threats, or maintain composure under pressure. And in the evenings, after the others had collapsed into their bunks, Flint found Sierra in the armory or on the range, and he taught her things that weren't in any manual. Your father understood something most shooters never learn, Flint said one night, both of them sitting on the range as darkness settled over the mountains. Shooting isn't just about the rifle. It's about becoming part of the environment, reading what the land tells you. Sierra listened, absorbing every word like gospel. Flint showed her techniques from another era, methods developed during the Cold War, when American forces trained for combat in places where technology might fail, and all you'd have was skill and instinct. He taught her how to construct hide sites that would remain undetected even under close inspection, how to move through terrain using shadows and natural contours, how to read atmospheric conditions that affected ballistics in ways most modern shooters never considered. "Why are you teaching me this?" Sierra asked one night. "I'm just a contractor. 3 weeks and I'm gone." Flint was quiet for a long moment. "Your father saved my life. I couldn't save his, but maybe I can give you what he would have taught you if he'd lived." "He already taught me," Sierra said, touching the rifle case beside her. "Through his journal." Journals can only teach so much. Some things need to be passed hand to hand, soul to soul. Flint looked at her in the darkness. "Your father wanted you to be more than just a good shooter. He wanted you to understand what the rifle means, the responsibility it carries." "I understand responsibility." "Do you?" "Because there's a difference between shooting targets and shooting people, between proving yourself and taking a life." His voice went quiet. "If you ever have to pull that trigger on a human being, you need to be certain, not confident, not skilled, certain, because that decision never leaves you." Sierra thought about her father's journal, about the passages where his handwriting changed, became heavier, more deliberate. The entries after his first combat deployment. She'd read those pages 100 times, trying to understand the weight he'd carried. "Did my father understand that?" she asked. "Better than anyone I've known," Flint said. "He never took a life lightly, never treated it as just another mission. Every time he asked himself if there was another way. And when there wasn't, when the shot had to be made, he made it clean, quick, merciful." He paused. "He said a rifle was a tool of precision, but using that tool without conscience, that's just murder from a distance." Those words settled into Sierra like seeds in dark soil. She didn't know it then, but they would grow, would bloom, would define choices she'd make in a desert halfway around the world. On the 14th day, they ran the hostage rescue simulation. It was the hardest test in the training cycle, a mock village with multiple buildings, civilian dummies mixed with hostile targets, time pressure, and consequences for mistakes. Each SEAL went through alone, required to clear the scenario with maximum speed and 0 civilian casualties. It was designed to be impossible. In 3 years of running the test, only 2 shooters had managed to complete it without hitting a single civilian. Most managed 1 or 2 collateral casualties. Some failed spectacularly, hitting more civilians than hostiles. The SEALs went first, moving through the village with practiced efficiency. They were good, fast, aggressive, decisive. But the scenario was built to punish aggression, to force impossible choices, to create situations where speed and caution warred with each other. Reese Atwood completed it with 1 civilian hit, a dummy that had been positioned behind a window at an angle that made threat discrimination nearly impossible. He came off the course frustrated, angry at himself for the mistake. "1 civilian," the range officer announced. "Acceptable within parameters. All hostiles neutralized. Time, 8 minutes, 40 seconds. The other SEALs performed similarly. 1 or 2 civilian casualties, completion times ranging from 8 to 12 minutes. All within acceptable parameters. All professional, competent performances. Then Sierra's turn came. She approached the village differently than the others. Instead of rushing in, she spent the first 90 seconds simply observing, mapping sight lines and angles, identifying where civilians might be positioned based on the layout. The SEALs watching from the observation point muttered among themselves. Time was ticking. She was wasting it. But Werner Flint, standing beside the range officer, said nothing. He just watched. When Sierra moved, she flowed like water finding its path. She didn't charge through buildings. She used angles the others had ignored, positions that gave her sight lines through multiple rooms at once. She read the scenario not as a series of individual engagements, but as a single, integrated problem, with a solution that required perfect geometry. Window target down, doorway hostile eliminated, rooftop threat neutralized. Each round found its mark with surgical precision, threading through gaps in the architecture that shouldn't have allowed clean firing lanes. Her movement pattern was unconventional, almost artistic in its efficiency. She cleared the entire village in 6 minutes and 18 seconds. 0 civilian casualties, every hostile neutralized. Several shots that made the observing instructors shake their heads in disbelief. Angles they hadn't thought were even available. Solutions to problems that shouldn't have had solutions. When she emerged from the final building and safed her weapon, the silence from the observation point was profound. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. The range officer checked his stopwatch 3 times, as if he couldn't believe the numbers. Finally, he keyed his radio. "All clear. 0 civilian casualties. All hostiles down. Time, 6 minutes, 18 seconds. "That's not possible," Atwood said. "The geometry doesn't work. You can't clear that village that fast without exposing yourself to crossfire." "She didn't clear it the way you did," Flint said quietly. "She saw it differently." That night, the dynamic shifted again. The SEALs didn't exactly welcome Sierra into their brotherhood, but the wall of hostility began to develop cracks. Atwood left an energy bar on her cleaning table, a small gesture, but meaningful in the Spartan world of special operations. Another SEAL asked her about her rifle setup, genuinely curious. A third started a conversation about wind reading techniques that lasted 20 minutes. By the end of the second week, she wasn't one of them, but she wasn't entirely an outsider anymore either. She'd earned something that military culture valued more than friendship: respect. On the 20th day, Wilson the contractor returned. He found Sierra and Flint on the range, working through long-distance shooting scenarios. "Contractor Calloway," Wilson said, looking uncomfortable in his khakis and polo shirt among the tactical gear and weaponry, "need to speak with you, privately." Sierra glanced at Flint, who nodded. She followed Wilson to a small office building at the edge of the facility. Inside, Wilson pulled out his tablet and swiped through several screens. His expression was serious, lacking the nervous friendliness he'd shown in Montana. "Your contract is being extended," he said without preamble. "Different parameters, higher classification." "I agreed to 3 weeks. That's what I'm giving you." "The Department of Defense is prepared to offer you $200,000 for an additional 3 weeks. Deployed position, Afghanistan. Advisory role only." Sierra's expression didn't change, but something cold moved through her chest. "Advisory role. You'd be attached to a SEAL team, provide sniper support and observations on their operational protocols. No direct engagement unless absolutely necessary." "No." Wilson had expected that. He pulled up another file on his tablet. "Before you refuse, understand what's at stake. The team deploying needs someone with your particular skills. They've requested you specifically." "They don't even know me." "Colonel Flint recommended you. Commander Nathan Greystone approved the request." Sierra looked toward the window, where she could see the mountains in the distance. Afghanistan. Combat deployment. Everything she'd avoided, everything she'd sworn she'd never be part of. "I'm not military," she said. "That's exactly why they want you. You see things differently, solve problems they don't know exist." Wilson closed the tablet. "I'm authorized to tell you that the mission is time-sensitive. High-value target. Intel suggests the window closes in 2 weeks. Then they should send their SEALs." "They are, but Commander Greystone specifically requested civilian oversight. Someone who's not bound by standard tactical doctrine." Wilson stood. "You have 24 hours to decide. After that, the offer expires." He left her alone in the office. Through the window, she watched the sun setting over the Virginia mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. That evening, Werner Flint found her sitting alone on the range, her rifle across her knees, staring into nothing. "You heard about Afghanistan," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not going." "Why not?" "Because I'm not a soldier. I don't want to be part of that world." Flint sat beside her, his old bones creaking slightly. "Your father said something similar once. After his first deployment, he told me he joined the army to serve, but combat had shown him the cost of service. Made him question whether he wanted to continue." What changed his mind? Nothing changed his mind. He still had doubts until the day he died, but he kept serving anyway. "You know why?" Sierra shook her head. "Because he decided that if good people refused to do hard things, then hard things would be done by people who didn't care about doing them right." Flint looked at her. "Your father never saw combat as glory. He saw it as responsibility. Someone had to stand between innocents and predators. He chose to be that someone. He died in training, never got to stand between anything. He died preparing to stand. That counts too." Flint was quiet for a moment. "You're not your father. You don't owe the world what he gave. But I'll tell you this, those SEALs going to Afghanistan are good men, warriors, but they're also human. They make mistakes. Having someone like you watching over them, someone who sees differently, who thinks differently, that might mean they all come home. Or it might mean nothing. I don't want that responsibility." "No one does. That's how you know you're the right person for it." Sierra turned that over in her mind, testing it against her instincts, her fears, her father's memory. "If I go," she said slowly, "I'm not promising anything. I observe, I advise if asked, but I don't become one of them." "You'll never be one of them," Flint said. "You'll be something else, something they need even if they don't know it yet." The next morning, Sierra found Wilson and gave him her answer. 3 words that would change everything. "I'll do it." Kandahar airfield sprawled across the Afghan desert like a scar on the Earth's surface. Temporary structures, blast walls, constant dust, and the ever-present sound of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. It was a machine of war, grinding away at an enemy that could never be fully defeated, only temporarily suppressed. Sierra arrived on a military transport, surrounded by soldiers and contractors, all of them looking exhausted before they'd even left the wire. She carried her rifle case, a small duffel of personal gear, and the weight of a decision she still wasn't certain about. Werner Flint had deployed with her, his role officially listed as Senior Tactical Advisor, but really just him refusing to let her walk into war alone. They moved through the base together, past checkpoints and security screenings, until they reached a briefing room where Commander Nathan Greystone waited. Greystone was 41 but looked older in the way combat commanders often did. Lines etched deep around his eyes, jaw tight with the weight of decisions that cost lives. He wore the bearing of a man who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen and made choices that couldn't be unmade. "Contractor Calloway," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard impressive things about your performance at Sentinel." "Sir," Sierra shook his hand, noting the calluses in the firm, brief grip. "I'll be direct. The mission parameters are straightforward. We're extracting a Taliban courier who's carrying intelligence on ISIS-K networks operating in the region. High-value target, but the operation is complicated by terrain and local tribal politics. We move fast, grab the courier, exfiltrate before hostiles can organize a response." He pulled up a map on the laptop in front of him. Kunar Province, mountain valleys, limited visibility, dozens of places for ambush. "My designated marksman is solid, but I want redundancy. You'll establish an observation post here," he pointed to a ridge overlooking the target village, "approximately 1.2 miles from our entry point. Observe, report, and advise only. Under no circumstances are you to engage without explicit clearance from me." "Understood," Sierra said. "Colonel Flint will accompany you to the OP. Radio contact throughout. If things go sideways, you extract to the backup landing zone and wait for retrieval. Questions? Intel confidence level? Greystone's expression tightened slightly. Medium high. The courier's presence is confirmed. Enemy strength is estimated at 8 to 12 hostiles. Poorly armed, no professional military training. Something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely confident in that assessment, but Sierra didn't push. She'd learned enough about military culture to know when commanders were repeating official intel they privately doubted. "We deploy at 2200 hours, Greystone said. "Get your gear sorted and try to rest. It's going to be a long night." The helicopter insertion happened under darkness, so complete it felt like flying through ink. No lights, no conversation, just the bone-rattling vibration of rotors and the occasional crackle of radio traffic. Sierra sat between Flint and a SEAL she recognized from Camp Sentinel, Reese Atwood, who'd graduated from skeptic to something approaching ally over the past 3 weeks. Atwood caught her eye in the darkness and gave a tight nod. Not quite friendship, but acknowledgement. "You're here, you're part of this, try not to die." The helicopter descended into a dry riverbed, touching down just long enough for the team to dismount before lifting off again, disappearing into the night sky. Silence rushed in to fill the space left by the rotors. Not complete silence. The mountains held sounds of their own. Wind over rock, distant animal calls, the occasional far-off vehicle. But the kind of quiet that made you aware of every breath, every footfall. The SEAL team moved out toward their objective, 8 shadows disappearing into terrain that swallowed them whole. Sierra and Flint went the opposite direction, climbing toward the ridge that would give them overwatch on the entire operation. It took them 90 minutes to reach position. The climb was brutal. Loose scree, sharp rocks, elevation that made breathing hard and movement harder. But by the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, they'd established a hide site that would be invisible to anyone more than 10 feet away. Sierra set up her rifle, ranged key landmarks, and created a mental map of the entire valley. Below, the target village looked peaceful. Small mud brick structures, narrow paths between buildings, a well at the center. People would wake soon, start their day, never knowing that armed men were moving toward them in the darkness. "Overwatch in position," Flint whispered into the radio. "Copy that," Greystone's voice came back, distorted by encryption. "We're moving to final staging area, 30 minutes to contact." Sierra's awareness expanded outward, reading the landscape like text. Wind patterns, temperature gradients, the way morning light would change visibility. This was different from Camp Sentinel. The targets here were real. The stakes were measured in lives, not scores. The sun rose, painting the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Beautiful and terrible at once, like most things in war. And then she saw something that made her pulse quicken. Movement on the far ridge. Not where it should be. Sunlight reflecting off glass or metal. Just a brief flash, there and gone, but enough. "Greystone, Overwatch," Sierra said quietly into her radio. "I've got movement northwest ridge, approximately 900 meters from your entry point. Unidentified possible hostile observation post." A pause. Then, "Negative Overwatch. Intel shows single cell, village confined. Probably local traffic." Sierra kept her scope on the position. Another flash. Definitely glass. Definitely watching the village. "Sir, I've got positive identification on optical equipment. Someone's running Overwatch. Could be a second cell." Overwatch. Intel assessment shows low probability of multiple cells in this sector. Maintain observation, but do not engage. We're proceeding with mission as planned. Flint, lying beside her, muttered something under his breath. He'd seen what she'd seen. They both knew what it meant. "Your call," he whispered, "but Intel's been wrong before." Sierra kept her rifle trained on the northwest ridge, tracking movement she could barely see, reading signs that shouldn't be there. Below, she watched the SEAL team enter the village, moving with practiced efficiency, clearing angles and approaching the target building. Everything looked clean, professional, by the book. But Sierra's instincts screamed warning. The intel had missed something critical. The mission they thought they were running wasn't the mission that was actually happening. Greystone, Overwatch, request permission to hold position and monitor Northwest Ridge. Copy that, Overwatch. Continue observation. The SEAL team reached the target building. Breached. Moved inside. Radio traffic increased. Brief bursts of communication confirming room clearance. No hostiles encountered. Target secured. And then, everything went to hell. The ambush erupted from 3 sides at once. Not 8 to 12 poorly armed hostiles. At least 20 fighters, coordinated, carrying modern weapons, moving with military precision. They'd waited for the SEALs to commit, to be deep inside the village with limited exit routes. Sierra had been right. There'd been a second cell, and they'd been watching, waiting, preparing. Contact! Multiple hostiles, all sides! Greystone's voice crackled over the radio, professional calm barely masking the urgency underneath. Gunfire erupted in the village. The SEAL team's designated marksman, positioned on a low rooftop, began engaging targets. But he was exposed, visible, and within seconds hostile fire found him. Sierra watched through her scope as the man jerked, twisted, went down clutching his shoulder. "Barnes is hit," someone shouted over the radio. "Overwatch, we need fire support." Sierra's finger rested on her trigger, steady as stone. She'd ranged the village during her initial setup. She knew every distance, every angle, every possible shot. 850 yards to the nearest hostile position, 920 to the second. Elevated shots, wind from the northeast, temperature rising as the sun climbed. "Overwatch, you are not cleared to engage." Greystone's voice cut through the chaos. "I repeat, not cleared." "Would you prefer dead teammates?" Sierra said quietly, and fired. The crack of her rifle echoed across the valley. 850 yards away, a hostile fighter who'd been setting up a machine gun position dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Clean kill. Instant. "Contact eliminated," she said into the radio, chambering another round. "Engaging targets." "God damn it, Overwatch." "Sir, with respect, your men are dying. I can help or I can watch. Choose now." A pause that lasted less than a second but felt like eternity. Then, "Cleared to engage, light 'em up." Sierra became something other than herself in that moment. Not a woman, not a person, but an extension of her rifle. A conduit for precision and purpose. Her father's training, Flint's teaching, years of solitary practice in Montana mountains, all of it converged into a series of shots that were as close to perfect as human skill could achieve. 920 yards, hostile behind corner, adjusted for wind, breathed, fired. Down. 870, fighter with RPG, led the target, squeezed. Down. 1060, sniper position on rooftop. Hardest shot, partially obscured, but she saw the angle, saw the gap, saw the solution. Fired. Down. Flint, watching through his own scope, called corrections and confirmations. Hit. Hostile neutralized. 3 more emerging from building east side. Range 890. Sierra swung her rifle, acquired targets, made micro adjustments. Each shot was a decision, a calculation, a choice. Each one took a life. She felt it, the weight her father had written about. But there was no time to process, no space for reflection. The SEALs were pinned down, taking fire, bleeding. Her father's journal entry flashed through her mind. "When you hold life and death, choose life." She fired again. The battle lasted 11 minutes. By the end, 9 hostile fighters were down, courtesy of Sierra's rifle. The others had broken contact, retreating into the mountains, unwilling to face an enemy they couldn't see. The SEAL team secured the courier and began their movement to the extraction point. But Sierra had stopped scanning for new targets. She'd found something else, something that made her heart stop and her breath catch. On the northwest ridge, exactly where she'd identified movement earlier, a figure had emerged. A man with a rifle, professional-grade optics, Western tactical gear, not Taliban, not local militia, a professional sniper. Foreign contractor, probably Chechen or Eastern European, and he was tracking the SEAL team's movement, positioning himself for a shot. Sierra zoomed in, saw him settling into a shooting position, saw his rifle swing toward the valley, saw him choose his target, Commander Nathan Greystone. Walking point, leading his team towards safety, unaware that death was measuring the distance to his heart. And then a red dot appeared on Greystone's chest. Laser designator. The enemy sniper had him dead to rights. 1,517 yards, uphill angle, wind shifting, an impossible shot even for a professional. But Sierra wasn't thinking about impossible anymore. She was thinking about 8 men with families, about Flint's teaching, about why her father had chosen to stand between innocence and predators. She ranged the enemy sniper. 1,517 yards, angle 18 degrees uphill, wind northeast at 7 knots, gusting to 12. She'd have to thread the needle through conditions that would make most snipers refuse the shot. Flint saw what she was seeing. Sierra, I know. If you miss, I won't. Her pulse slowed. Everything slowed. The world contracted to a tunnel that held only her, the rifle, the wind, the distance, and the man who was about to kill Nathan Greystone. Breath in, breath out, heartbeat steady, wind calculation, elevation compensation, all the physics, all the math, all the training, but also something beyond training, instinct, certainty, the absolute knowledge that this shot would fly true because it had to. The rifle cracked like judgment itself. 1,517 yards away, the bullet flew through air and time and probability. It covered the distance in less than 2 seconds, carrying with it the sum of Sierra Calloway's skill, her father's legacy, and Werner Flint's teaching. The enemy sniper never saw it coming. The bullet entered through his rifle scope, an impossibility, a shot that shouldn't exist, a violation of odds and logic, and ended his life instantly. The red dot vanished from Greystone's chest. In the valley below, Greystone stopped walking, stood perfectly still, touched his chest where the laser had painted him, feeling for a wound that wasn't there. His head swung around, looking back up toward the ridge where Sierra and Flint were hidden. He keyed his radio. "Overwatch, did you just—" "Enemy sniper neutralized," Sierra said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You're clear to extraction point. How far was that shot?" "Does it matter?" A pause, then quietly. "No, I suppose it doesn't. Overwatch, you just saved my life." Sierra didn't respond. She was staring at her rifle, at her hands, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just a profound awareness of what she'd done, what it meant, what it cost. Flint put a hand on her shoulder. "Your father would be proud." "I just killed a man I never met." "You saved 8 men who have families waiting for them. That's not nothing." "Doesn't feel like something either." They packed up the hide site in silence, erasing evidence of their presence, preparing for extraction. Below, the SEAL team reached the landing zone. The helicopters came in low and fast, loading personnel and the captured courier before disappearing into the morning sky. Sierra and Flint were extracted last, pulled out by a separate bird that left no connection between them and the official mission. As the helicopter climbed away from the mountains, Sierra looked back at the valley where she'd taken her first human life. The distance between her and that moment was already growing, measured in meters and minutes. But she knew with absolute certainty that the distance would never be enough. That shot would stay with her forever. Back at Kandahar, Sierra went directly to the armory and began cleaning her rifle with methodical, almost desperate precision. Flint found her there an hour later, still working the cloth along the barrel, her movements repetitive, mechanical. "First time is always the hardest," he said gently. "Does it get easier?" "No, but you learn to carry it better." "I'm not sure I want to learn that." Flint sat beside her. "Your father wrote something in a letter he sent me after his first deployment. He said killing changes you, but the way it changes you is your choice. You can let it make you hard, make you cruel, make you into something you don't recognize. Or you can let it make you more aware of how fragile life is, how precious each breath is, how important it is to choose carefully when you hold that power." Sierra's hands finally stopped moving. What did he choose? He chose to carry it with honor, to never take a life lightly, to make sure every shot counted for something bigger than himself. Flint stood. "You made that same choice today, whether you realize it or not." Later, the CIA advisor assigned to the mission burst into the command center where Greystone was debriefing. Contractor Calloway violated 3 separate protocols, engaged without proper authorization, exposed her position, exceeded her operational parameters. "She saved my team," Greystone cut him off, his voice flat and hard. "Barnes was hit. We were pinned down. She provided fire support that allowed us to complete the mission and extract with all personnel alive." "That's not the point." "That's exactly the point. You can file your complaint. I'll file mine about intelligence that missed a second hostile cell and nearly got my entire team killed." Greystone leaned forward. "Your choice." The advisor backed down, but his expression promised this wasn't over. That evening, Wilson appeared again with another contract offer. Full JSOC attachment, classified missions, substantial pay increase. Sierra refused without even hearing the details. "I'm done," she said simply. "The DOD, I don't care what the DOD wants. I did what I came here to do. Now I'm going home." Dawn came cold and clear. Sierra stood on the airstrip, her rifle case at her feet, watching the sun paint the Afghan mountains in shades of copper and gold. Beautiful country, she thought. Terrible war. She heard boots on concrete and turned to find Nathan Greystone approaching. He wasn't in tactical gear anymore. Full dress uniform, crisp and formal, looking more like an officer than a warrior. "Contractor Calloway," he said formally, "I need to say something." "You don't owe me." "Please." His voice carried weight that went beyond words. "Let me finish." Sierra went quiet. Greystone stood straighter, if that was even possible. Then deliberately he removed his cover, brought himself to attention, and saluted. It wasn't a casual gesture, not a pro forma acknowledgement. It was a full, proper military salute, held with absolute sincerity. "You have no rank," he said, his voice carrying across the empty airstrip. "No name on any official roster. No uniform or oath or commission. But you have something that most soldiers never earn in an entire career. You have the absolute respect of everyone who witnessed what you did yesterday." Sierra stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. She wasn't military. She couldn't return the salute. Protocol didn't even have a category for this moment. "Sir, I can't." "You don't have to. This isn't about protocol. This is personal." His hand remained at his brow. "You saved my life, my team's lives, and you did it without hesitation, without orders, without thought for your own safety. That's the definition of heroism." Movement behind him. Reese Atwood emerged from a building, followed by the other SEALs from Greystone's team. All in dress uniform, all moving into formation, all coming to attention, and one by one, they saluted. 8 warriors, men who'd earned their tridents through trials that broke lesser people, offering the highest honor their culture recognized to a civilian woman with no rank and no name. Sierra felt her throat tighten, not breaking, opening. She didn't return the salute, couldn't, wouldn't, didn't have the right, but she gave something else. A deep nod, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. Acknowledgement. Respect returned in the only way she knew how. When they finally lowered their hands, Greystone approached closer. "Who was he? The sniper you shot?" "I don't know. Professional contractor probably. Eastern European, judging by his gear. 1,517 yards. Through his scope. That's not just a good shot. That's impossible." "Apparently not," Greystone almost smiled. "If you ever change your mind about the JSOC offer, you'd have a place with us. No questions asked." "I won't change my mind, but thank you." She boarded the transport plane alone, carrying her rifle and the weight of a decision she'd never take back. As the plane lifted off, banking away from Kandahar toward home, she looked out the window at the desert falling away below. Somewhere down there, a man lay dead because she'd chosen to pull a trigger. Somewhere down there, 8 men were alive for the same reason. She didn't know which truth was heavier, didn't know if she ever would. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she'd made the right choice. And that was going to have to be enough. 6 months after Afghanistan, Sierra Calloway ceased to exist in any official capacity. The Department of Defense closed her contractor file with a notation that was bureaucratically bland and entirely uninformative. Contract completed. No further engagement planned. Wilson sent follow-up emails that went unanswered, phone calls that rang through to voicemail. Eventually, he stopped trying. Werner Flint knew better than to search for her. He'd seen the look in her eyes on the flight back from Kandahar, the way she'd stared out the window at nothing and everything at once. She'd crossed a line that changed people, and she needed time to figure out who she was on the other side of it. But he thought about her, wondered if she was all right, hoped she'd found some measure of peace. At Camp Sentinel, life continued its rhythmic cycle of training and deployment, warriors coming through to sharpen their skills and test their limits. But something had shifted in the culture. Instructors started telling a story about a civilian contractor who'd outperformed every SEAL candidate, then deployed to Afghanistan and made a shot that redefined what was possible. They didn't use her name. Most of them didn't know it. But they called her Ghost, and the legend grew with each retelling. The woman with no rank who'd earned a salute from a SEAL commander. The shooter who'd saved a team from 1,500 yards out through conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. Reese Atwood, who'd returned to Sentinel as an instructor after his deployment, found himself telling the story to new classes. He'd stand at the 1,000-yard line where Sierra had shot her perfect score and say, "I watched her shoot. I thought I knew what excellence looked like. I was wrong." One recruit, cocky and young, asked if the story was exaggerated, if maybe the legend had grown beyond the truth. Atwood's expression went cold. "I was there. I saw the red dot on my commander's chest. I saw it disappear. That's not legend. That's fact. She saved 8 lives that day, including mine, and she did it without hesitation, without orders, without anything except skill and courage." After that, no one questioned the story again. In the shadowy world of special operations, where classified missions created gaps in official records and accomplishments went unrecorded, Sierra's methods began appearing in unexpected contexts. A SEAL team instructor mentioned her shooting technique in a tactics paper. A Marine Scout sniper school updated their wind reading curriculum based on methods observed in field conditions by an unnamed civilian asset. A Delta Force training manual included a case study on non-traditional observation post utilization that described, without attribution, exactly how Sierra had positioned herself in the Afghan mountains. She was becoming institutionalized without ever having joined the institution. Her methods were being studied, adapted, incorporated into the machine she'd walked away from. Commander Nathan Greystone, back at Naval Special Warfare Headquarters in Virginia, found himself thinking about her more often than he expected. Not in any romantic sense, that would have been inappropriate and impossible given the circumstances of their meeting, but with professional curiosity and something deeper. Gratitude, certainly, but also a kind of wonder at what she represented. She'd proven something that military culture rarely acknowledged, that excellence didn't require the institution, that skill could exist outside the hierarchy, that courage didn't need a uniform, that honor wasn't limited to those who took the oath. It bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate, made him question assumptions he'd held his entire career. One evening, sorting through mail at his desk, he found a postcard. No return address. Montana postmark. The front showed a mountain landscape, all granite peaks and alpine forest. The back held no message, just coordinates written in precise, careful handwriting. He looked up the coordinates. They pinpointed a ridge in the Montana wilderness, miles from any town or road. A place so remote it might as well be another planet. Greystone stared at that postcard for a long time, understanding what it was. Not an invitation, not a request for contact, just acknowledgement. I'm still here, still watching, still alive. He filed it carefully in his personal records, knowing he'd never use the information, but unable to throw it away. Rumors started circulating through military channels. Sightings, unconfirmed reports of a woman matching Sierra's description appearing at underground shooting competitions, dominating the field and disappearing before anyone could approach her. Someone claimed to have seen her at a range in Wyoming, making shots that drew a crowd, then vanishing while people were still trying to figure out who she was. A security contractor in Jordan swore he'd seen her at a private facility where former special operations personnel trained bodyguards and security teams, said she'd run a demonstration that left everyone speechless, then declined a lucrative job offer and left without explanation. A wilderness survival instructor in Idaho mentioned teaching techniques he'd learned from a woman who knew more about living off-grid than anyone I'd ever met. When pressed for details, he just shrugged. She didn't give a name, didn't need to. You could see it in how she moved, how she read terrain. She'd been doing it her whole life. Each report was isolated, unverifiable, possibly apocryphal, but together they created a pattern. Sierra Calloway was out there, moving through the world like smoke, leaving traces but never staying long enough to be pinned down. Werner Flint heard the stories and smiled to himself. She was doing exactly what he'd hoped she'd do, living on her own terms, taking what she needed from the world and giving back what she chose to give. Not beholden to anyone, not trapped by obligation or expectation. But he also worried, because he knew what carrying that weight did to people over time. The memory of that shot in Afghanistan, the life she'd taken, the lives she'd saved. It would be with her always, shaping her in ways she might not recognize yet. He hoped she had someone to talk to, someone who understood. In the fall, 8 months after Afghanistan, a package arrived at a veterans nonprofit organization in Helena, Montana. Plain brown paper, no return address, postmarked from somewhere in Idaho. The director, a retired Army sergeant who ran support programs for combat veterans, opened it without much expectation. They got donations sometimes, unsolicited materials, the occasional crank letter. What he found made him sit down hard. A manuscript, bound simply with string, no cover page, just a title on the first page. Through the Scope, Precision, Ethics, and the Weight of Distance. No author listed, no explanation, just page after page of content that was simultaneously technical manual and philosophical meditation. Written by someone who clearly understood both the mechanics of long-range shooting and the psychological cost of applying those mechanics against human targets. The director read the first chapter standing at his desk, then sat down to read the second, then couldn't stop until he'd finished the entire manuscript 3 hours later. By the end, his hands were shaking slightly. This wasn't just a how-to guide. It was a confession, a warning, a love letter to a craft that could kill or save, depending on who wielded it and why. The author, whoever they were, had poured their soul onto these pages. Chapter titles read like poetry. The breath between shots, controlling fear. When the crosshairs find a face. Honoring the rifle, legacy and responsibility. Distance as mercy, distance as curse. The final chapter was titled simply, The Salute I Couldn't Return, and it described, in careful detail, without naming names or locations, what it meant to be acknowledged by warriors when you stood outside their brotherhood. The weight of that recognition, the impossibility of reciprocating, the strange, hollow feeling of being honored for something that felt more like burden than achievement. The director read that chapter twice, then picked up his phone and called a friend who worked at SOCOM headquarters. "I need you to see something," he said, "and then I need you to tell me if I'm crazy." 2 weeks later, the manuscript was being quietly circulated through special operations communities. No official channels, no formal distribution, just copies passed from hand to hand, instructor to instructor, warrior to warrior. It spread like wildfire through dry grass, finding an audience that desperately needed what it offered. Permission to acknowledge the cost of what they did, language to describe experiences they'd never been able to articulate. A SEAL team sniper read it in a CHU in Syria and wept. A Marine Scout sniper instructor in Quantico incorporated passages into his ethics curriculum. A Delta operator planning to retire called his wife and said, for the first time in their marriage, "I need to talk to someone, a professional, about what I've carried." The manuscript changed people. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in subtle ways that accumulated. Conversations started happening that hadn't happened before. Questions got asked that hadn't been asked. The culture of silent suffering began developing cracks. And in those cracks, something new began to grow. A young Marine corporal, 23 years old and fresh from a deployment that had broken something inside him, read the chapter titled Precision as Mercy, and understood for the first time that what he felt wasn't weakness, it was humanity. He wrote a letter to the unknown author, care of the Helena nonprofit, poured his heart out in ways he'd never been able to with his unit psychologist or his family. Described the shot he'd made, the insurgent who'd been carrying an RPG toward a school, the absolute certainty and the absolute horror of taking that life. You wrote that killing changes you, but the way it changes you is your choice, he wrote in conclusion. I've been letting it make me hard, make me angry, make me hate myself. Your words showed me another path. Thank you for teaching me that precision can be mercy, that distance can be grace, that I can carry this weight without letting it crush me. He addressed the envelope, mailed it, never expected a response. He never got one. But 3 months later, he received a polished brass cartridge in a small box. No note, no explanation. Just that single round, clearly fired, clearly important to whoever sent it. He understood the message. You're not alone. Others have fired these shots. Others carry this weight. You'll survive this. We all do. He kept that cartridge on his desk through 2 more deployments, a promotion to sergeant, and eventually his transition back to civilian life. It became his talisman, his reminder that someone out there understood. He never learned who sent it, but he didn't need to. Werner Flint received his copy of the manuscript in December. He read it alone in his quarters at Camp Sentinel, and by the final chapter, tears were running down his weathered face. The dedication at the end read, "To Colonel Werner Flint, who taught me my father's legacy was worth carrying, and to Garrett Calloway, who taught me that a rifle is a tool of precision, but using that tool without conscience is just murder from a distance." He folded the manuscript carefully, placed it in his desk drawer, and sat in silence for a long time. She was all right. Changed, certainly. Marked by what she'd done, absolutely. But all right. More than all right, she was teaching others, sharing what she'd learned, creating legacy from trauma. Garrett would have been proud. Hell, Flint was proud, and he'd only known her for a few weeks. He picked up his phone, started to dial her number, then stopped. She'd reached out in the only way she could, through the manuscript, through the words she couldn't say directly. Calling her would violate that boundary, would force a conversation she wasn't ready for. So instead, he wrote a letter. Pen and paper, old-fashioned, the way his generation had communicated when words mattered and distance was measured in days, not seconds. "Dear Sierra," he began, then paused, considering, started over. "Dear Ghost," he wrote, "I received your manuscript. It's the finest piece of writing on our craft that I've read in 50 years of service. More than that, it's the truest. You've given voice to things we've all felt but couldn't express. Warriors across the entire special operations community are reading your words and feeling less alone. That's a greater accomplishment than any shot, any mission, any medal. Your father would be beyond proud. I am honored to have known you, to have taught you what little I could, to have witnessed who you've become. If you ever need anything, a conversation, a place to decompress, or just silence shared with someone who understands, you know where to find me. With deepest respect, Werner Flint." He mailed the letter to the Helena nonprofit, care of The Unknown Author, knowing it would probably never reach her, but needing to send it anyway. 3 weeks later, he found a response in his mailbox. Not a letter, just a photograph. Sierra standing on a mountain ridge at sunset, her father's rifle case at her feet, looking out over a valley that stretched to the horizon. On the back, in that same precise handwriting, "Still watching, still learning. Thank you for teaching me how." Flint pinned that photograph to the bulletin board in his office, where it remained until the day he retired. Spring came to Montana with the sudden intensity of a resurrection. Snow melted, rivers swelled, and the high country opened up like a fist unclenching after a long winter of holding tight. Sierra returned to the wilderness that had raised her, to the cabin that her uncle had maintained until his death the previous winter, to the solitude that felt more like home than anywhere else on Earth. She'd spent the months since Afghanistan wandering, unable to settle, driven by restlessness she couldn't name. The shooting competitions, the brief teaching gigs, the manuscript written in motel rooms and truck stops, all of it had been movement without destination, running without pursuit. But eventually, the running stopped. Eventually, you had to turn around and face what you'd been fleeing. She stood at her father's grave in Fort Harrison National Cemetery one cold April morning, the first time she'd visited since she was a child. The headstone was simple. Garrett Calloway, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army Rangers, 1968 to 2002. Beloved husband and father. She'd brought his leather jacket, the one she'd been wearing since she was 16, too big for her but comfortable in ways that went beyond physical fit. She draped it over the headstone carefully. "I did what you taught me, Dad," she said quietly. "Made the shot, saved lives, but it's heavier than you wrote about. Or maybe I'm just not as strong as you were." A voice behind her, rough with age. He felt it just as heavy. He was just better at hiding it. Sierra turned to find an old man approaching, Korean War veteran's cap, cane in hand, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones remembered younger, harder days. The cemetery groundskeeper, she realized, someone who'd been tending these graves for decades. "You knew him?" she asked. "A bit. He'd come here sometimes before he died. Said he was visiting friends who hadn't made it back from the Gulf. We'd talk." The old man studied her. "You've got his eyes, and his way of standing like you're always measuring distances. He taught me to shoot." "He taught you more than that, I'd wager." The groundskeeper looked at the headstone. "He told me once that his greatest hope was that his daughter would be strong enough to use what he taught her, but wise enough to know when not to. Sounds like maybe you figured that balance." Sierra thought about Afghanistan, about the shots she'd made and the shots she'd refused, about the manuscript she'd written and the silence she'd chosen, about legacy and burden and the strange arithmetic of saving lives by taking one. "I'm still figuring it," she admitted. Good, that means you're paying attention. The old man tapped his cane against the ground. Your father was proud of you before you were born. Bet he's prouder now, wherever he is. He walked away slowly, leaving Sierra alone with ghosts and memories and a grief that had finally, after 22 years, begun to transform into something else. Not acceptance, not peace, but perhaps understanding. She left the jacket on the headstone, walked away carrying only her rifle case and the knowledge that some weights got lighter when you stopped trying to carry them alone. The shooting range outside Missoula was small and privately owned, the kind of place where locals came to sight in their hunting rifles and practice before elk season. Sierra had been coming here for 3 weeks, showing up at odd hours, shooting alone, leaving before anyone could start a conversation. But today, someone was waiting for her. A young woman, mid-20s, athletic build, with eyes that held determination and something else, hunger. The kind of hunger Sierra recognized because she'd seen it in her own reflection for most of her life. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman said as Sierra set up her rifle. "The ghost." Sierra didn't respond, just continued her setup routine, muscle memory and deliberate calm. "I enlisted because of you," the woman continued. "I heard the stories about Camp Sentinel, about Afghanistan, about the shot that shouldn't have been possible. I wanted to be like you. You don't want to be like me. I want to be a sniper. I want to be the best. I need to know if I'm good enough." The young woman's voice carried a note of desperation. "Please, just one session. Test me. Tell me if I have what it takes." Sierra finally looked at her, really looked, saw herself a decade ago, angry and hungry and convinced that skill would fill whatever emptiness lived inside. Saw the same mistake she'd made, thinking that excellence in killing would somehow make you more alive. "What's your name?" Sierra asked. "Emma, Corporal Emma Vance, Marine Corps." "Why do you want to be a sniper, Emma?" "Because it matters, because it's precise, because it's important." Those are good answers, but they're not true answers. Why do you really want it? Emma's expression flickered. "Because I need to be the best at something. Because I need to prove I belong. Because—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "Because if I'm good enough, if I'm skilled enough, then maybe I'll feel like I matter." Sierra recognized that truth because she'd lived it. The belief that competence could substitute for connection, that skill could fill the void left by loss, that if you were just good enough at killing things from a distance, maybe the distance inside you would close. "I'll make you a deal," Sierra said. "I'll teach you today. One session. But if you learn what I actually have to teach, you might not want to be a sniper anymore." Emma's eyes widened. "I'll take that chance." They spent 4 hours on the range. Sierra taught fundamentals, but she taught them differently than any instructor Emma had encountered. She talked about breathing not as a mechanical process, but as a conversation with your nervous system. About wind not as an obstacle to overcome, but as information to receive. About the rifle not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. Emma was good, better than good. Natural talent obvious in every shot, every adjustment, every moment of focus. By the 3rd hour, she was hitting 800-yard targets with consistency that would have impressed most military instructors. But Sierra kept pushing deeper, asking questions between shots. "Why that adjustment? What are you feeling? What's the rifle telling you?" And finally, as the sun started its descent toward the mountains, "If that target was a person, could you pull the trigger?" Emma's hands went still on her rifle. Long pause. Then quietly, "I don't know." "That's the most honest answer you've given me today." Sierra set down her own rifle. Being a sniper isn't about being the best shot. It's about carrying the weight of taking human life and not letting it destroy you. It's about making impossible choices and living with them afterward. It's about distance. The distance between you and your target, yes, but also the distance between who you were before and who you become after. Did it change you? Emma asked. The shot everyone talks about? Sierra was quiet for a long moment. Yes, in ways I'm still discovering. Ways that matter more than the shot itself. Do you regret it? No, but I carry it. Every day. And I'll carry it for the rest of my life. Sierra looked at the young Marine. You're good enough. You have the skill. But skill is the easy part. The question isn't whether you can make the shot. It's whether you can live with having made it. Emma stared at her rifle, processing. Finally, what should I do? I can't answer that, but I can tell you this. If you decide to pursue this path, do it for the right reasons. Not to prove yourself, not to fill an emptiness. Do it because you understand the responsibility and you're willing to carry it with honor. Like my father did. Like I'm trying to. They packed up as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Before Emma left, she turned back. If I need guidance, if I have questions, how do I reach you? Sierra pulled a card from her pocket. Werner Flint's contact information at Camp Sentinel. Talk to him. Tell him Ghost sent you. He'll teach you what you need to know, and he'll tell you the truth about whether this path is right for you. Emma took the card, nodded, and walked toward her truck. Halfway there, she turned back again. Thank you for being honest, for not just telling me what I wanted to hear. Honesty is all I have to offer. After Emma left, Sierra sat alone on the range, watching darkness settle over the mountains. She thought about legacy, about what we pass down and what we keep, about teaching and learning and the strange algebra of human connection. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Contractor Calloway? A familiar voice. Nathan Greystone. Commander, how did you get this number? I'm resourceful, and I need to ask you something. A pause. Would you be willing to make an appearance? Nothing official. No speeches required. Just show up. Where? Norfolk, Naval Special Warfare Symposium. We're establishing an award, the Ghost Protocol Award, annual recognition for ethical marksmanship, for snipers who demonstrate not just skill, but conscience. I'm giving the keynote. Thought you might want to hear it. Sierra's grip tightened on the phone. I don't do public appearances. I know. That's why I'm asking, not telling. This isn't about you. It's about what you represent, what you taught us. His voice went quieter. We're better because you were there. I'd like to acknowledge that, even if it's just to a room full of people who'll never know your real name. Sierra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the invitation. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance she'd worked so hard to create. But another part, the part that had written the manuscript, that had taught Emma, that had left her father's jacket on his grave, understood that legacy required witnesses. I won't speak, she said finally. I won't be introduced. I'll watch from the back, and I'll leave before anyone notices. That's all I'm asking. When? 2 weeks. I'll send details. But 2 days before the symposium, Sierra received unexpected visitors. She was splitting wood behind her cabin when she heard the vehicle approach. A black SUV, government plates, moving slowly up the dirt track. 3 men emerged, Wilson and 2 others in suits, carrying themselves with the rigid formality of federal agents. Miss Calloway, Wilson said, his earlier nervousness replaced by something harder. We need to discuss operational security. Sierra set down the axe, kept her hands visible but ready. I'm retired. There's nothing to secure. Your manuscript has created complications. One of the suited men stepped forward. Certain details about classified methodologies. I named no names, gave no locations, violated no laws. Nevertheless, the department requires assurances. He produced a document. Sign this non-disclosure agreement, agree to cease all publications, and we'll consider the matter closed. Sierra looked at the document. A muzzle, a cage, everything her father had warned about institutions trying to control truth. And if I refuse? Wilson's expression hardened. Then we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies, possibly revoke your security clearances. I never had clearances. You made sure I stayed off the books. Sierra smiled without humor. You made me disappear from all records. Can't prosecute someone who doesn't exist. The suited man's jaw tightened. Ms. Calloway, we're trying to be reasonable. No, you're trying to silence something that makes you uncomfortable. The idea that warriors might have consciences, that killing should weigh on you, that honor matters more than secrecy. She picked up the axe, not threateningly, just returning to her work. I'm going to Norfolk. I'm going to bear witness to the legacy my work created. And unless you want to explain to Congress why you're harassing a civilian who saved 8 SEAL team operators, you'll leave me alone. Wilson opened his mouth, closed it. The suited men exchanged glances. Finally, they retreated to their vehicle without another word. Sierra watched them disappear down the track, her heart pounding but hands steady. The choice was made. She'd go to Norfolk. She'd stand in the light, just for a moment. And they couldn't stop her. The Norfolk Symposium took place on a gray October morning, the kind of weather that made everything feel muted and serious. The auditorium held 200 people, SEAL instructors, Marine Scout sniper trainers, Delta Force advisors, military psychologists, and a scattering of civilian contractors. All of them gathered to discuss advances in precision marksmanship, tactical innovations, and ethical considerations in modern warfare. Sierra slipped in through a side door as the opening remarks concluded. She wore civilian clothes, kept her gray cap pulled low, and took a seat in the back row of the balcony where shadows pooled thick. From here, she could see everything and be seen by no one. The morning sessions covered technical topics, ballistics, equipment upgrades, training protocols, competent presentations by competent professionals. Sierra listened with half attention, her mind elsewhere, wondering why she'd agreed to come. Then lunch ended, and Nathan Greystone took the podium for the keynote address. He looked older than Sierra remembered, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. But he moved with the same confidence, the same bearing of a man who'd led people through hell and brought them back alive. I want to tell you about a sniper, he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. She had no rank, no formal military training, no trident, no tab, no designation that would make her officially one of us. The room went quiet. This wasn't the speech they'd expected. She showed up at Camp Sentinel as part of an experiment, a baseline to measure our training effectiveness against. Most of us thought it was a joke. A civilian woman testing herself against Navy SEALs? We were skeptical. Some of us were hostile. We'd earned our place through blood and suffering, and here was someone who'd walked in off the street. Greystone paused, let that settle. She outshot every single one of us, not by a little, by a lot. Perfect scores, impossible shots, techniques we'd never seen. She made us look like amateurs on our best day. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Sierra felt her pulse quicken. But that's not why I'm talking about her today. Technical skill is impressive, but it's not rare. The military produces excellent marksmen every year. What made her different was what happened in Afghanistan. He pulled up a slide. No images, just text. Date, location, mission parameters. Classified details redacted, but enough to establish context. My team was extracting a high-value target. Intelligence was wrong. We walked into an ambush. 20-plus hostiles, coordinated, professional. Our designated marksman took a hit in the first 30 seconds. We were pinned down, taking casualties, and I made a call that violated her rules of engagement. I told her to engage. The room was absolutely silent now. She'd been positioned over a mile away, observation post only, explicitly forbidden from direct combat action. But she didn't hesitate. She provided fire support that allowed us to complete the mission and extract alive. 9 confirmed kills in 11 minutes, ranges from 850 to over 1,000 yards. in combat conditions that would challenge any sniper in this room. Greystone's voice dropped lower, more intense. But that's still not the important part. The important part came after we'd secured the objective and were moving to extraction. An enemy sniper, foreign contractor, professional equipment, expert positioning, had tracked our movement. Got a laser designator on me. I was dead. I knew it. My team knew it. He paused and Sierra saw his hand unconsciously touch his chest where the red dot had painted him. She made a shot that shouldn't exist. 1,517 yards. Uphill angle. Variable wind. Through the enemy sniper's scope. One shot, one kill, and the red dot disappeared from my chest. She saved my life with a shot that violated physics, improbability, and common sense. Someone in the audience whispered, "Jesus Christ." When we got back to base, I did something I'd never done before. I saluted a civilian, removed my cover, stood at attention, and rendered honors to someone who had no rank and no right to receive them. And you know what she did? The audience leaned forward. Nothing. She didn't return the salute. Couldn't. She wasn't military. But she nodded. And in that nod was more understanding of what it means to be a warrior than I've seen in most people who've worn the uniform for decades. Greystone advanced to the next slide. A plaque, bronze and dignified, engraved with text. The Ghost Protocol Award. Established today, awarded annually to snipers who demonstrate not just technical excellence, but ethical clarity. Who understand that a rifle is a tool of precision, but using that tool without conscience is just murder from a distance. Who make impossible shots to save lives, not take them. Who carry the weight of their actions with honor. He looked out at the audience, and Sierra felt his eyes sweep past the balcony without finding her. She'll never know I'm giving this speech. She disappeared after Afghanistan, won't answer calls, won't respond to offers, won't claim credit for what she did. She's a ghost, that's what we called her. Still out there somewhere, still shooting, still teaching in her own way. And we're all better warriors because she showed us that excellence doesn't require the institution, that courage doesn't need a uniform, that honor exists in places we weren't smart enough to look. He stepped back from the podium. I'll never be able to thank her properly. Can't even say her name in a room like this. But I can do this. He gestured to the plaque. I can make sure that every year we honor people who shoot the way she did. With skill, yes, but also with conscience. With precision, absolutely, but also with mercy. That's her legacy. That's what she taught us. The applause started slowly, then built, until 200 people were standing, honoring someone they'd never met, whose real name they'd never know. In the balcony, Sierra sat very still. Tears ran down her face, silent and unexpected. She'd thought watching would be manageable, that she could observe from distance and remain untouched. She'd been wrong. Reese Atwood, sitting in the third row, happened to glance up at the balcony. His eyes locked on a figure in the shadows, backlit by the exit sign. Gray cap, leather jacket, absolutely still despite the standing ovation around her. He nudged the operator next to him, pointed subtly upward. Greystone followed the gesture, saw the silhouette, and something passed across his face. Recognition, gratitude, closure. Sierra met his eyes across the distance, gave the smallest nod, the same one she'd given on the Kandahar airstrip, the only acknowledgement she could offer. Greystone returned it, a moment of connection between two people who understood things that couldn't be spoken. Then Sierra stood and slipped through the exit door, disappearing before the applause ended, before anyone could approach, before the moment could become anything other than what it was. Outside in the gray October afternoon, she walked to her truck and sat behind the wheel for a long time. The tears had stopped, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Not complete, not permanent, but real. She'd been seen, acknowledged, honored, and she'd let it happen without claiming it, without making it about her, without needing anything in return. That felt like progress, like healing, like maybe she was finally learning to carry the weight the way her father had, with honor, with humility, with the understanding that legacy wasn't about taking credit. It was about what you left behind when you walked away. 6 months later, a young Marine instructor at Quantico found something unusual on his target after morning qualifications. A polished brass cartridge, clearly fired, placed carefully in the exact center of the bullseye. Beside it, a small card with a single sentence: "Precision is mercy. Pass it on." No signature, no explanation. But he understood. Somewhere out there, the ghost was still teaching, still watching, still making sure the next generation learned what really mattered. He pocketed the cartridge, added the card to his instructor materials, and that afternoon, he changed his lesson plan, started teaching not just how to shoot, but why it mattered. Not just the mechanics of killing, but the ethics of choosing when killing was necessary and when it wasn't. One student, then another, then another. The ripples spreading outward from a single shot made 18 months ago in the Afghan mountains, changing the culture one person at a time. 2 weeks after leaving the cartridge, Sierra's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Colonel Flint accepted me into advanced training. He said you were right. Skill is the easy part. He's teaching me the hard part, carrying the weight with honor. Thank you for pointing me toward the right teacher. And thank you for being honest enough to scare me. That's what I needed. CPL Vance." Sierra read it twice, then typed a response she'd never sent to anyone before. "Your father would be proud. Keep the conscience sharp as the shooting. Tell Flint the ghost says hello. S." She hit send, knowing Emma would understand. The legacy was passing forward. Not just techniques, but wisdom. Not just how to kill, but when not to. That's what mattered. In Montana, Sierra stood on a ridge overlooking a valley that stretched to the horizon. Sunset painted the sky in shades of fire and gold. Her rifle case sat at her feet. Her father's brass scope, the one she'd given to Werner Flint, the one he'd mailed back to her with a note that said, "This was always yours," hung from her neck on a leather cord. She wasn't hunting, wasn't practicing, just watching, being present in the moment, in the place that had made her, feeling the wind on her face and the weight of everything she'd carried settling into something she could live with. In the distance, a young deer picked its way through the grass, pausing occasionally to test the wind, alert and alive and beautiful. Sierra watched it without the hunter's instinct she'd carried her whole life. Just appreciation. Just presence, just peace with the idea that some things were meant to be observed, not taken. The sun touched the horizon, and the world held its breath in that moment between day and night, light and dark, before and after. Sierra picked up her rifle case, turned toward home, and walked away from the ridge. Behind her, the sky burned with the last light of day. Ahead, darkness gathered with the promise of stars. She'd been a ghost long enough. Time now to figure out what came after. Time to become human again. But she'd never stop watching, never stop teaching, never stop honoring the legacy her father had given her and the responsibility it carried. Somewhere in the Montana wilderness, a woman with no rank and no name kept her vigil. And the warriors she'd saved, the students she'd taught, the people she'd touched, they carried her forward, shooting with conscience, leading with honor, understanding that precision was mercy and distance could be grace. They called her Ghost. But she'd never been just a reflection. She'd been the sound that changed everything. The shot that proved excellence could exist outside the system. The reminder that skill without ethics was just violence. But skill with conscience could save the world. One impossible shot at a time. And if you ever see a gray cap on a distant ridge, know that someone's watching. Someone's ready. Someone who learned from her father and taught the next generation that the most important target isn't the one in your sights. It's the person you become after you pull the trigger.